Book 1, The Lands of the United States. Stave 4. Railroad Grants. Some 4 million acres have been donated for the construction of various wagon roads, and some 4.5 million acres for the construction of canals. Still, by far the largest grants have been to railroads. The amount given to these companies within the last 10 years aggregating nearly 1/2 as much as all the public lands disposed of in other ways since the formation of the government. This policy was not commenced until 1850, when 6 sections per mile, or in all 2,595,053 acres, were granted for the construction of the Illinois Central Road. This donation was made to the state, and by it assigned to the company on condition of the payment to the state of 7% of its gross receipts in lieu of taxation. This grant, which now seems so insignificant, was then regarded as princely, and so it was, as it has more than paid for the building and equipment of the road. The example being set, other grants, of course, followed. In 1862, a long leap ahead in the rapidity of the disposal of the public lands was taken in the passage of the first Pacific Railroad Bill, giving directly, without the intervention of states, to the Union, Central, and Kansas companies 10 sections of land per mile, at that time the largest amount ever granted, and $16,000 per mile in bonds. In 1864, this grant was doubled, making it 20 sections or 12,800 acres per mile. At the same time, the bonded subsidy was trebled for the mountain districts and doubled for the interior basin, while the government first mortgage for the payment of the bonds was changed into a second mortgage. But the disposition to give away lands kept on increasing, and the Northern and Southern Pacific getting no bonds, the land grant to them was again doubled, making it 40 sections or 25,600 acres per mile, or, to speak exactly, 20 sections in the states and 40 sections in the territories. To these 3 Pacific roads alone have been given 150 million acres, in round numbers more than is contained in all Germany, Holland, and Belgium, with their population of over 50 millions, more land than that of any single European state except Russia. The largest single grant, and it is a grant unparalleled in the history of the world, is that to the Northern Pacific, which aggregates 58 million acres. And besides this, these roads get 400 feet right-of-way, which in the case of the Northern Pacific amounts to 100,000 acres, what land they want for depots, stations, etc., and the privilege of taking material from government land, which means that they may cut all the timber they wish off government sections, reserving that on their own. With these later grants, the plan of setting aside a tract on each side of the grant in which the companies may make up any deficiency within the original limits by reason of settlement has also been inaugurated. Thus, the grant to the Southern Pacific withdraws from settlement a belt of land 60 miles wide in California and 100 miles wide in the territories, and that to the Northern Pacific withdraws a belt 120 miles wide from the western boundary of Minnesota to Puget Sound and the Columbia River. Since the day when Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage, we may search history in vain for any parallel to such concessions. Munificence, we call it. Why, our common use of words leaves no term in the English tongue strong enough to express such reckless prodigality. Just think of it. 25,600 acres of land for the building of 1 mile of railroad, land enough to make 256 good-sized American farms, land enough to make 4,400 such farms as in Belgium support a family each in independence and comfort. And this given to a corporation, not for building a railroad for the government or the people, but for building a railroad for themselves, a railroad which they will own as absolutely as they will own the land, a railroad for the use of which both government and people must pay as much as though they had given nothing for its construction. The value of these grants. If we look but a few years ahead, to the time when we shall begin to feel the pressure of a population of 100 millions, the value of these enormous grants is simply incalculable, but their immediate value is greatly underestimated. Land was given to the first Pacific roads as though it had not, and never would, have any value. Money enough to build the roads, and leave princely fortunes besides, was placed in the hands of the companies, and the land was thrown in as a liberal grocer might throw an extra lump of sugar into the already falling scale. Yet it is already apparent that by far the most valuable part of these franchises are these land grants. The timber which the Central Pacific gets in the Sierras will of itself yield more than the cost of the whole road. In addition, it has large amounts of good agricultural lands in California and along the Nevada River bottoms, and millions of acres of the best grazing lands in the sagebrush plains of Nevada and Utah. At the same time, there are thousands of acres of its lands which will have enormous value from the coal, salt, iron, lead, copper, and other minerals they contain. The Union Pacific lands in the Platte Valley have, so far as sold, yielded it an average of $5 per acre. And though it gets no timber to speak of, it has millions of acres, which will soon be valuable for grazing, and for a long distance its route passes through the greatest coal and iron deposits of the continent, where much of its 12,600 acres per mile will in time be valued at thousands of dollars per acre. 20 years ago, when the Illinois Central received its grant, its lands were worth no more than those now given to the Northern Pacific. Yet the lands sold by the Illinois Central have averaged over $12 per acre, and those yet remaining on hand are held at a still higher price. Counting at the company's price what is held, the grant has yielded over $30 million, much more than the cost of the road. If 6 sections per mile will do this in 20 years, what should 40 sections per mile do? The directors of the Northern Pacific have themselves estimated their grant to be worth $10 per acre on the completion of the road. I think they rather under than overestimated it, and for an obvious reason. A true statement of the real value of the grant would tend to discredit the whole affair in the eyes of the cautious foreign capitalists, from whom the company seeks to borrow money, for they would not believe that any government could be extravagant enough to make such a donation. But it must be remembered that the line of the Northern Pacific passes for nearly its whole length, through as fine an agricultural country as that of Illinois, that its grant consists, in large part, of immensely valuable timber and mineral land, and that it will build up town after town, one of them at least a great commercial city, on its own soil. Furthermore, for reasons before stated, the increase in the value of land during the next 20 years must be much greater than it has been in the last 20 years. Taking these things into consideration, is it too much to say that in 20 years from now, the lands of the company will have sold for, or will be worth an average of at least $20 per acre? At this rate, the grant amounts to over $500,000 per mile, or, in the aggregate, to the enormous sum of $1,160,000,000, a sum more than half the national debt. This donated absolutely to one corporation. And for what? For building a road that cannot cost more than $80 million, and for building it for themselves. No keener satire upon our land grant policy could be written than that which is to be found in the published advertisement of this Northern Pacific Company. The directors show that if they get an average of only $2 per acre for their land, they can pay the whole cost of building and equipping the road, and have a surplus of some $20 million left. That is to say, the government might have built the road by merely raising the average price of the lands $1 per acre, and have made a profit by the operation, while it would then own the road, and could give or lease it to the company which would agree to charge the lowest rates. As it is, the government has raised the price to settlers on one half the land $1.25 per acre. The other half it has given to the company to charge settlers just what it pleases. And then, on this railroad, which it has made, the settlers pay for over and over again. Both government and settlers must pay for transportation, just as though the road had been built by private means. The argument for railroad grants. So plausible and so ably urged are the arguments for these grants, such general acceptance have they gained, and so seldom are they challenged, for the opposition which has been made has been rather against the extravagance than the theory of the grants, that it is worthwhile to consider them with some care. The plea for railroad land grants is about this. By giving land to secure the building of railroads, we develop the country without expense, or at least at the expense of those who largely profit by the operation. The land, which we give, is useless as it is. The railroad makes it useful and valuable. The government, giving really nothing of present value, does not even deprive itself of that which it might receive in the future, for it is reimbursed for the selling price of the land it gives by doubling the price of the land it retains. The government, in fact, acts like a sagacious individual who, having an unsaleable estate, gives half of it away to secure improvements which will enable him to sell the other half for as much as he at first asked for the whole. The settler is also the gainer, for land at $2.50 per acre, with a railroad is worth more to him than land at $1.25 per acre without a railroad, and vast stretches of territory are open to him to which he could not otherwise go for lack of means to transport his produce to market. At the same time, the country at large is greatly the gainer by the enormous wealth which railroads always create. "Here are thousands of square miles of fertile land," cries an eloquent senator, "the haunt of the bear, the buffalo, and the wandering savage, but of no use whatever to civilized man, for there is no railroad to furnish cheap and quick communication with the rest of the world. Give away a few million acres for the building of a railroad, and all this land may be used. People will go to settle, farms will be tilled, and towns will arise, and these square miles, now worth nothing, will have a market and a taxable value, while their productions will stream across the continent, making your existing cities still greater and their people still richer, giving freight to your ships and work to your mills." All this sounds very eloquent to the land-grant man who stands in the lobby waiting for the little bill to go through, which is to make him a millionaire, and really convinces him that he is a benefactor of humanity, the Joshua of the hardy settler and the Moses of the downtrodden immigrant, and backed up as it is by columns of figures showing the saving in railroad over wagon transportation, the rapidity of settlement where land grants have been already made, and the increase in the value of real estate. It sounds very plausible to those who have not anything like the reason to be as easily convinced as has the land-grant man. But will it bear the test of examination? Let us see. In the first place, it must be observed that the consideration for which we make these grants is purely one of time, to get railroads built before they would otherwise be built. No one will seriously pretend that, without land grants, railroads would never be built. All that can be claimed is that, without grants, they would not be built so soon, that is, until the prospective business would warrant the outlay. This is what we get, or rather, expect to get, for we do not always get it. What do we give? We give land. That is, we give the company, in addition to the power of charging, practically what it pleases, for the carrying it does, the unlimited power of charging the people who are to settle upon one half the land for the privilege of settling there. If the government loses nothing, it is because the settlers on one half of the land must pay double price to reimburse it, while the settlers on the other half must pay just what the company chooses to ask them. Now, in the course of the settlement of this land, there comes a time when there are enough settlers, together with the prospective increase of settlers, to warrant the building of a railroad without a land grant. Admitting that the settlers who come upon the land before that time are gainers by the land grant in getting a railroad before they otherwise would, it is evident that the settlers after that time are losers by the amount of the additional price, which they must pay for their land, for they would have had a railroad anyhow. And this point where the gain of settlers ceases and the loss of settlers commences is very much nearer the beginning of settlement. That is to say, there are fewer gainers and more losers than might at first glance be supposed. For if there were no land grants at all, the land would be open to settlers as homesteads, or at $1.25 per acre. Therefore, the number of actual settlers which would justify the construction of a non-land grant railroad would be very much smaller than that which would suffice to furnish a land grant railroad with a paying business, as the prospective increase during and upon the completion of the road would be very much greater. Therefore, when, by giving a land grant, we get a railroad to precede settlement, if the first settlers gain at all, the others lose. The gain of the first is lessened by their having to pay double price for their lands. The loss of the others is mitigated by no gain, so that, as far as settlers are concerned, we are sacrificing the future for the present. We are taxing the many for the very questionable benefit of the few. And even in the case of the gainers, their first advantage, in having a railroad before its natural time, is offset by the subsequent retardation of settlement in their neighborhood which the land grant causes. For if the first effect of the land grant is to hasten settlement by getting a railroad built, its second effect is to retard it by enhancing the price of lands. Illinois, where the first railroad land grant was made, may, in a year or two, have had more people, but for years back, her population has certainly been less because of it. For nearly 500,000 acres, 1/5 of this grant remained unoccupied in 1870, the company holding it at an average price of $13 per acre. If this land could have been had for $1.25 per acre, it would have been occupied years ago. This is the case wherever land grants have been made, and long before the territories, in which we are now giving away 25,000 acres per mile for the building of railroads, are 1/10 settled, we will be asked to give away like amounts of other unappropriated territory, if there is any by that time left, in order to furnish cheap homes to the settlers. Considering all the people who are to come upon our now unoccupied lands, weighing the near future with the present, is it not evident that the policy of land grants is a most ruinous one, even in theory, even when we get by it that which we bargain to get? Let us see how it affects the community at large in the present. Where a land grant is necessary to induce the building of a road, it is because the enterprise itself will not pay. That is to say, at least, that it will not yield as large a return for the investment as the same amount of capital would yield if invested somewhere else. The land grant is a subsidy, which we give to the investors to make up for this loss. Is it not too plain for argument that where capital is invested in a less remunerative enterprise than it otherwise would be, there is a loss to the whole community? Whether that loss is made up to the individuals by a subsidy or not, only affects the distribution of the loss among individuals. The loss to the community, which includes all its individuals, is the same. But it will be said, though this may be true so far as the direct returns of the railroad are concerned, there are other advantages from railroad building besides the receipts from fares and freight. The owners of the land through which the road passes, the producer and the consumer of the freight which it carries, and the passenger who rides upon it, are all benefited to an amount far exceeding the sums paid as fares and freight. When we give a land grant, we merely give the railroad company a share in these diffused profits, which will make up to it the loss that would accrue were it confined to its legitimate share. Thus, here is a railroad, the business of which would not pay for building it for 5 years yet. The loss to the unsubsidized company, which would build it now and run it for 5 years, would be $10 million, but the gain to landowners and others would be $100 million. Now, if by a land grant or otherwise, we secure to the railroad company a share of this collateral gain, amounting to $20 million, the railroad company will make a profit of $10 million instead of a loss of $10 million by building the road, and others would make a profit of $80 million. But it must be remembered that every productive enterprise, besides its return to those who undertake it, yields collateral advantages to others. It is the law of the universe, each for all and all for each. If a man only plants a fruit tree, his gain is that he gathers its fruit in its time and its season. But in addition to his gain, there is a gain to the whole community in the increased supply of fruit and in the beneficial effect of the tree upon the climate. If he builds a factory, besides his own profit, he furnishes others with employment and with profit. He adds to the value of surrounding property. And if he builds a railroad, whether it be here or there are diffused benefits, besides the direct benefit to himself from its receipts. Now, as a general rule, is it not safe to assume that the direct profits of any enterprise are the test of its diffused profits? For instance, it will pay to put up an ice-making machine in New Orleans rather than in Bangor. Why? Because more people in New Orleans need ice, and they need it more than those in Bangor. The individual profit will be greater because the general profit will be greater. It will pay capitalists better to build a railroad between San Francisco and Santa Cruz than it will to build a like railroad in Washington Territory. Why? Because there are more people who will ride, and more freight to be carried on the one than on the other. And as the diffused benefit of a railroad can only inure from the carrying of passengers and freight, is it not evident that the diffused benefit is greater in the one case than in the other, just in proportion as the direct benefit is greater? In the second place, in any particular case in which we have to offer a subsidy to get a railroad built, the question is not, shall we have this railroad or nothing, but shall we have this road in preference to something else? For the investment of capital in one enterprise prevents its investment in another. No legislative act, no issue or bonds, no grant of lands can create capital. Capital, so to speak, is stored up labor, and only labor can create it. The available capital of the United States at any given time is but a given quantity. It may be invested here or it may be invested there, but it is only here or there that it can be invested. Nor is there any illimitable supply abroad to borrow from. The amount of foreign capital seeking investment in the United States is about so much each year, and if by increasing our offers we get any more, we must pay more, not merely for the increased amount which we get, but for all which we get. To recur now to our former example, here is a railroad through an unsettled country, which to build now would, relying upon its direct receipts, entail a loss of $10 million, the diffused benefits of which may be estimated at $100 million. Here is another railroad which it would take the same capital to build, which, in the same time, would yield a direct profit of $5 million, and the diffused benefits of which it is fair to presume might be expressed by $300 million. Now, if we offer to the builders of the first road a land grant, which will enable them to obtain 1/5 of the diffused benefits of the road, we could induce them to build that road rather than the other, for they would make twice as much by doing so. But what would be the net result to the community? Clearly, a loss of $215 million. That is to say, by offering a land grant, we could induce capitalists to build a road in Washington Territory rather than between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. But if we did do so, the people between San Francisco and Santa Cruz would lose far more than the capitalists, and the Washington Territory settlers would gain. The people of the Pacific Coast, as a whole, and the United States as a whole, would be poorer than if we had left capital free to seek the investments which would of themselves return to it the largest profits. The comparison between an individual and the nation is fallacious. The one is a part, the other is the whole. The individual lives but a few years. The lifetime of the nation is counted by centuries. It may profit an individual to induce people to settle or capital to be invested in certain places. The nation can only profit by having its population and its capital so located and invested that the largest returns will be realized. It may profit an individual to sacrifice the near future to the present, but it cannot profit a nation. As concerns the statistics by which the benefits of land-grant railroads are attempted to be shown, it must be remembered, first, that the population of the United States is growing at the rate of 1 million per year. Next, that increase in the value of land is not an increase in wealth. That whatever population railroads have brought to new states and territories is dispersion, not increase, is proven by the fact that the population of the United States is not increasing faster than it did before railroad building commenced. At the same time, the slightest consideration of economic laws shows that whatever gain has resulted from their building is at the expense of a greater gain which would have resulted from the investment of the same capital where it was more needed. In fact, there is no gain, but a loss. We have been supposing that land grants secure the consideration for which they are given, the building of roads before they would otherwise be built, but this is far from being always the case. With the exception, perhaps, of the Little Stockton and Copperopolis Road, the California grants have not hastened the building of railroads, but have actually retarded it by retarding settlement. The fact is that in nearly all cases, these land grants are made to men who do not propose and who have not the means to build the road. They keep them, procuring extensions of time when necessary, until they can sell out to others who wish to build, and who, on their part, generally delay until they can see a profit in the regular business. To sum up, when we give a land grant for the building of a railroad, we either get a railroad built before it would be built by private enterprise, or we do not. If we do not, our land is given for nothing. If we do, capital is diverted from more to less productive investments, and we are the poorer for the operation. In either case, the land grant tends to disperse population. In either case, it causes the monopolization of land. In either case, it makes the many poorer, and a few the richer. I have devoted this much space to answering directly the argument for railroad land grants, because they are constantly urged and are seldom squarely met, and because so long as we admit that we may profit by thus granting away land in reasonable amounts, we shall certainly find our lands going in unreasonable amounts. But surely it requires no argument to show that this thing of giving away from 12 to 25,000 acres per mile of road in order to get people to build a railroad for themselves is a wicked extravagance for which no satisfactory excuse can be made. This land, now so worthless that we give it away by the million acres without a thought, is only worthless because the people who are to cultivate it have not yet arrived. They are coming fast. We have seen how fast. While there is plenty of uncultivated land in the older states, we are giving away the land in the territories under the plea of hastening settlement. When the time comes that these lands are really needed for cultivation, they will all be monopolized. The settler, go where he will, must pay largely for the privilege of cultivating soil, which, since the dawn of creation, has been waiting his coming. We need not trouble ourselves about railroads. Settlement will go on without them, as it went on in Ohio and Indiana, as it has gone on since our Aryan forefathers left the Asiatic cradle of the race on their long westward journey. Without giving away the land, railroads, with every other appliance of civilization, will come in their own good time. Of all people, the American people need no paternal government to direct their enterprise. All they ask is fair play, as between man and man. All the best government can do for them is to preserve order and administer justice. There may be cases in which political or other non-economic reasons may make the giving of a subsidy for the building of a road advisable. In such cases, a money subsidy is the best, a land subsidy the worst. But if the policy of selling our lands is continued, and it is desirable to make the payment of the subsidy contingent upon the sale of the land, then the proceeds of the land, not the land itself, should be granted. There is one argument for railroad land grants, which I have neglected to notice. Senator Stewart pleads that these grants have kept the land from passing into the hands of speculators who would have taken more than the railroad companies and have treated the settlers less liberally than the companies. Perhaps he is right. There is certainly some truth in his plea. But if he is right, what does that prove? Not the goodness of railroad grants, but the badness of the laws, which allow speculation in the public lands.